When is the last time you had a callus? In case you don't know, a callus is the result of when a part of your skin experiences friction against something else. If it occurs repeatedly, eventually a part of your skin becomes hardened and thicker, and then you have a callus. Usually, you get them on your hands or your feet, but you can get them almost anywhere you have skin, and sometimes as the result of wounds. Sometimes people get calluses intentionally, and sometimes they just happen. When Jeanette and I were going on our pilgrimage 2 years ago and preparing to walk 500 miles across northern Spain on the Camino, we both bought shoes for the occasion, and we needed to develop calluses before we went. We bought the shoes 8 months in advance so that we would have time to develop our calluses. If you don't develop calluses, the danger is that you develop blisters, and blisters can literally stop people in their tracks. We knew people along the Camino who had to drop out because of their blisters. That was a time when we were intentionally developing calluses, and it worked. Neither one of us had a single blister in more than 500 miles of walking. There was also a time, though, that I developed calluses that were not intentional. During college, I worked one summer on the grounds crew, and for 8 hours a day, I worked outside with tools. My hands were as rough and hard as you can imagine by the end of the summer. I didn't like how they looked because they were little raised things. I didn't like how they felt. But there was no getting rid of them until I put the tools down and the skin on my hands healed. These days, if I had to join a grounds crew, I would wear gloves to add a layer of protection. Do you have any calluses at the moment? Can you remember a time when you did have calluses and whether you developed them intentionally? Calluses can serve a good purpose on our hands or on our feet, but they do not serve a good purpose on our hearts. Jesus grieves deeply when our hearts are hardened, calloused. Today is a day to consider how thick the calluses on our hearts have become and how we can heal those calluses. Today's story about the man with the withered hands ends up spotlighting the calluses on the Pharisee's heart that Jesus feels angry and deeply grieved about. We are told the religious authorities wanted to bring charges against Jesus, so they were watching him carefully in the synagogue, ready to trip him up. What's interesting is that the man with the withered hand was in the synagogue, but the story does not say that he asked to be healed. Instead, Jesus saw him and asked him to stand up so that everyone could see him. Jesus then asked those who were gathered if it was legal on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill. Another way of saying that might be, what is justice in this case? Is it just on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill? No one answered the question that Jesus asked. The law said they were to do nothing on the Sabbath, no work of any kind, and healing could be seen as work. The story tells us Jesus was deeply grieved at their unyielding or hard or calloused hearts. One of the definitions of this word in Greek is the covering with a callus. Jesus then asked the man to stretch out his hand, and Jesus healed him, and the plot to destroy Jesus thickened. One of the ways we often read the stories in the Bible is by putting ourselves somewhere in the story or by siding with someone in it. When you heard this story initially that Steve read, where did you place yourself, or with whom did you side? My guess would be that many of you, like me, played the good students and answered Jesus' question by saying, "It's always better to do good and save a life." Most of us would have sided against the authorities who were trying to trap and accuse Jesus. Most of us, we like to think, would have felt compassion for the man with the withered hand and would applaud Jesus healing him. Was there a single one of us who heard the story and identified with the Pharisees? We've long been told that the Pharisees were hypocrites, and so we have distanced ourselves from them in every way, in every story. To our minds, they were the legalistic right-wing part of various Jewish groups at that time. Jesus was trying to build a movement that went beyond legalism and opened the doors for marginalized people, and so we try to stick close to Jesus, and we think that means being on the other team whose opponents were the Pharisees. So we're on this side, they're on that side. But that kind of thinking is not what Jesus was after, and when we reduce these stories to that conclusion, we miss so much. You should know I had a whole different sermon written for this morning, and I set it aside. You might have noticed that the prayer for wholeness doesn't go exactly with this sermon. It's because this sermon is new. Today seems like a day to focus on the calluses on our hearts, those places where we have lost feeling and have simply built up layers and layers of protection against the ones with whom we disagree. The purpose of a callus is to protect sensitive skin from friction and abrasion and tension that can create a painful spot that can develop into a blister. A blister can be filled with fluid, it can pop, it can become infected, it's kind of gross. It can erode layers of your skin if the friction and tension continue on it. But if you don't let your skin develop a blister, you can slowly thicken the skin and create a callus so that when friction happens, you don't feel it. Now translate that to what happens in our hearts. The election of the current president 4 years ago was when most of us had to decide how we would treat or respond to the friction in our hearts. What we have seen and what we have heard and what we have just experienced in this election is that our calluses go deep. We cannot do anything about other people's hard hearts or calloused hearts. What we can do is focus on our own. In 12-step language, this means we can stay on our side of the street because our side is the only thing we can change. It's interesting and providential in some ways that we are entering into our stewardship season. At its most basic level, stewardship means care of. God calls us to take care of and to care for what God has given. We care for the earth, for all living creatures, for our neighbors, for ourselves. It is care for ourselves and what we have become in the past 4 years that I'm highlighting today. How do we heal the calluses on our hearts so that we can feel again? So that Jesus is not deeply grieved by us, too. It's so much more tempting to focus on the calluses on the other side of the street, to look at those we deem opponents or enemies, and to want to fix their calluses because we're convinced they have them. But that's not the stewardship God calls us to. Bummer. I am so much better at that kind of stewardship, as I'm sure you are as well. I tried really hard to not contribute yesterday in any way to gloating or being divisive. And then after I heard the speeches last night, all of a sudden it occurred to me that Betsy DeVos will lose her job. And that is one of my most calloused places. And I wrote on Facebook, "Bye-bye, Betsy, it's been unreal." My better angels did not prevail, and my hard heart was on full display. In last week's sermon, my friend Alan Hilton preached about how there are steps we can take in loving our enemies and our neighbors, which is often so difficult. There are also steps we can take to heal the calluses on our hearts. Calluses are not permanent unless you keep the friction in the same spot. I no longer have the calluses on my feet that I had when I walked the Camino. I no longer have the calluses on my hands that I had when I was on the grounds crew. Once I changed up my activities, the hardness went away and my skin is sensitive once again, and I have feeling in those places. How do we soften the hard places in our hearts? I want to suggest 3 concrete actions that can help each of us get the feeling back in our hearts. We can change up our activities, we can listen to understand, and we can attend to our most sensitive places. First, changing up our activities. To develop a callus, you have to do the same thing over and over to create the friction on the same spot. What have you been doing in the past 4 years, or maybe longer, over and over and over again? Have you watched the same news program every day? Have you read the same newspaper or the same columnists every day? Have you talked to the same friends or relatives who think exactly like you do every day? Have you read the same outrageous things from someone with whom you know you disagree in order to be angry and fueled all over again? Have you read tweets every single day? Have you simply held up the hand to those you deemed as ignorant or evil? Someone I talked to this week said one of the reasons they think so many people still voted for the incumbent is that the Democrats have become increasingly condescending, and no one wants to have a conversation with someone they perceive as condescending. I defended the Democrats for a minute, and then I listened more deeply and realized there is some truth to that. And then I thought about what it means to be a leader and how easy it is to run out in front and yell back at everyone and tell them to hurry it on up and catch up. Those of us who identify as educated and progressive often spend our lives wanting other people to catch up because we've decided we have the answers, or at least the knowledge and the information. Maybe one of the activities we need to change up is slowing down and walking with someone who is walking at a different pace, or perhaps on a very different path. You who know me know that this would take a great deal of intention and attention and concentration for me. It would not be natural or instinctual. Who are the people in our lives from whom we have become separated? Who are the ones God might be calling us to walk alongside differently instead of shouting back and telling them to hurry and catch up? You might start with the ones you know and love. We all know that listening for understanding has been in short supply for at least the past 4 years. On one side, we say there's no reason to understand lying and corruption and cruelty and bullying and harm and hatred. On the other side, they say, why would we listen to you who think you know it all? As I was talking with Joel this week, who's the editor and publisher of the publication In These Times, and a part of our congregation, I was struck by something Joel said. He was talking about the huge shift in rural parts of our country, and he told me about the town he grew up in and how it has changed over time and has voted in the past 2 elections for the current president. He said, we have no idea what's happening in rural America, and if the Democratic Party wants to be a party for everyone, they're going to have to understand. What he said stayed with me because, honestly, I have felt no curiosity about that. I have simply decided I'm done with this, with these people, and I've given up. If there's any healing that will happen in our hearts, I think it will be because we make the choice to listen to people who are different and to listen for understanding. Most of us have been geared up for arguments, for defense, for claiming actual reality instead of what we have assumed was a pseudo-reality going on in our country. This is a difficult one for me and leads into our third action of attending to our own sensitive places. Attending to our sensitive places means getting aware of the ways in which we are hooked, or the ways in which our past trauma is re-engaged, or simply identifying the most sensitive places for us. Sometimes we have to go back in time to understand. Anyone who was bullied as a child or as an adult has had their trauma re-engaged. Anyone who was sexually abused has had their trauma re-engaged. Anyone who has been the victim of a hate crime has had their trauma re-engaged. Anyone who lived with an alcoholic has had their trauma re-engaged because of the lying and the creation of alternative realities. The list goes on for all the ways so many of us have been hooked and our trauma re-engaged in the past 4 years. No wonder we have developed calluses. An alternative to the calluses is to attend to those sensitive places. Just because there will be a new president and vice president does not mean there will be a return to safety. We each have individual work to do in order to be present for the work ahead of us. If you need help or suggestions, or you want to explore that more, let me know. Having a broken heart is not the same as having a calloused heart unless we cover the pain of our brokenness intentionally. There might be an argument for how we simply had to develop calluses in order to get through the past 4 years. Either way, we have to come back to ourselves, and as stewards given the task of caring for, we hear the words in Mark this morning that tell us Jesus grieves deeply over our calloused hearts. But let us never forget that Jesus is a healer, and if we will yield our hearts to Jesus, we can experience healing. And it isn't magic. As always, we are called to be a part of the healing, and there are concrete actions we can take to invite Jesus to heal us. Which action or actions will you take in the coming week or month or year? And even more importantly, do you want to be healed? Amen.